Welcome to Lesson 1. In this lesson, we'll be painting the Aurora Borealis, or Northern Lights, on a starry sky overlooking evergreen trees in a snow-covered field. We'll start with a grayscale painting, and then tint it to add color. Before we begin, I want to point out this new set of swatches. I'll be describing shades of color using a 9-step value scale. A value of 1 is pure white, and 9 is pure black. Neutral gray is right in the middle at 5. So from here on out, that's how I'll be communicating which shade of color to pick. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and start painting. I'm going to create a new canvas, and I'm going to use one of my presets here, which is 18 by 24 inches at 150 dpi. If you find that your computer has difficulty working on large canvases, feel free to use a smaller canvas size or lower the resolution to 72. I have my reference image loaded down here in my reference image palette, so we can go ahead and start composing the painting. First, let's plot out our composition by creating a sketch. So I'll create a new layer and name it Sketch. And we will choose a 7 value. And the brush that we'll use is the Detail Oils brush. And you want this to be pretty thin in diameter. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and define the horizon first. That'll be right around the lower third of the canvas here. And if you want, you can make it a little bit wobbly here. It doesn't have to be perfectly level. You want it to look like the snow is kind of lumpy and piling up in different places. And then we'll sketch in the tree line, and we want it to have a sense of perspective, so maybe we'll have a vanishing point that's somewhere around here. We'll go ahead and sketch in the tree line. So we'll have the trees kind of start to converge down here at that vanishing point. And then we want to keep some of the sky open on the top up here for our aurora, which we will have. It'll go kind of something like this. Just roughly sketch it in. We'll have a sun that is right around here, and that'll kind of be making these light rays that come through. And we'll have a tree. Maybe we'll have a tree here in the foreground. We'll have another one here. I mean, you can go ahead and place these in as you're painting, but I'm just giving you an idea of what I'm going to paint here. And then of course there'll be some shadows, but we'll worry about those later. In the snow, we'll draw a few contour lines just to help us kind of visualize how our snow is going to flow here. And then now we can go ahead and start filling in some of these layers, some of these main layers here. So we'll create a new layer for sky. We'll just turn down the opacity of the sketch a little bit so it's not going to interfere with our painting here. And on that sky layer, we'll select a number 3 value here, and then we'll use the fill command to go ahead and fill the canvas with that color. We'll create another layer above that for snow. I'm going to select a value of 5 this time, and the scratchboard tool, and we'll go ahead and paint in our horizon, following our guide. Doesn't have to be exact. Let's go ahead and soften the edge of the horizon a little bit using the blur blender. And just paint right along the edge, go back and forth a few times. What that's going to do is it's just going to make it a lot less sharp. It'll just look better that way. And then that may have created some white fringe, so what you'll want to do is turn on Preserve Transparency, use that same scratchboard tool and hold Alt to sample that same gray color. And just paint along the edge, and that'll paint gray over any white fringe that might be present there, because that would be bad if that shows up later in the painting. It's harder to get rid of later, so I always try to take care of that stuff early on. We can turn off Preserve Transparency now that we don't need it anymore. Let's start adding in some of these trees. So we'll create a new layer. We'll call it Trunks. We'll move it below the snow layer. Now what we'll want to do is we'll want to turn on Perspective Guided Strokes using this little shortcut up here. And don't really worry about any of these settings right now, because we're just going to use this to lock our lines vertically. So what we want to do is we want to select a number 8 value here for our trunks, and we will use the Jitter Scratchboard brush. We want kind of a thin brush size, but not too thin, and you don't want it to be too thick because we want these to look distant. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use this perspective drawing mode to keep our lines nice and vertical. So you can go through pretty quickly here and just start putting in trees, and you want them to be vertical, so be careful. You want to use different brush diameters where you get something kind of like this that looks Nice and natural. There we go. Now we have some nice trunks. We can go ahead and turn off that perspective drawing mode. You may have to go to the perspective guides and turn it off. I've also made some keyboard shortcuts for this workspace. If you hit P on your keyboard, once perspective guides is turned on, the P will toggle between the modes, so you can quickly turn it on and off that way. And if you use Shift P, you will toggle the perspective drawing on and off. So right now it's on. If I do Shift P, you can draw freehand, Shift P again, back in the perspective mode. So that's pretty handy. Right now I want it to be off. So let's go ahead and add some foliage to these trees. We'll create a new layer. We'll call it Treeline Front. And we're going to use a special image hose brush for this. So we want to select the linear size P angle D color image hose brush, and the nozzle that we want, we just expand this here so we can see, is going to be under the painterly category and fan dabs. And it's going to use your additional color, so you'll have to remember that you have to toggle between your main color and your additional color. Otherwise you might get stuck. So we'll toggle our additional color on, and we're going to want an 8 for our value here. And what you should get is something like this when you draw. Now you can do downward strokes or you can do upward strokes depending on what kind of tree you want to make. The trick to painting evergreen trees is to paint from the top to the bottom following your trunk. And you want to use short strokes or taps and vary your pen pressure. You want to start with light pressure at the top and use heavier pressure as you near the base. It's usually best to size your brush rather large, but if you're having trouble getting the pressure to work, you can resize your brush incrementally. Once all of your trunks are covered, make sure to fill in any awkward gaps near the bottom of the tree line with more dark foliage. So I'm just going to fill in the bottom here just to add a little more content to the base. Now let's add some trees to the background. So we will go ahead and just hide this nozzle library to get it out of the way. We'll create a new layer, and that will be below the trunks layer. We'll call it Trees Background. We'll make this a multiply composite method. This will be just a soft area behind the tree line to give a sense of really, really distant trees. We'll choose the sponge, and we'll go with an 8 value here. We'll go ahead and just paint in the background. Now, you're barely going to be able to see this. It's just something that's going to be there in the background, and it'll just help fill it in and help it look more natural. If you find that this ends up being too dark, you can always play with the layer opacity, but I think that looks good, so I'm going to leave it like that. Now, let's select that same linear size P angle D color brush, and we still have that nozzle selected. And what we'll want to do is we'll want to add some more layers of trees like we did in the foreground here. So I'm going to create a new layer, and we'll call this Treeline Mid, which will just be middle. And we want to select a lighter value than what we were using. So let's go ahead and go with a 6 here and see how that looks. I think that will work. And so we want to put in some trees here in the background. Now these ones don't necessarily need to have their own trunks because they're going to be mostly covered up by the trees in front of them. You just want some indications of trees. If you want, you can hide your sketch if that's just getting in your way. I'm kind of going in between the dark trees because it doesn't make any sense to paint behind them really, because then you won't be able to see the paint that you put down. So I'm just kind of using it to fill in these gaps. You do want to go in some of these areas here in the middle to fill that in. This will really start to make your piece look nice and layered, like your forest is going into the background. You can do as many of these layers as you want. I'm going to do one more tree line back, and I want to use an even lighter color, so I'm going to go this time to a 4. Let's see how that looks. That's nice. So I'm going to put in some even lighter ones here in the background. So these are just really far away trees. Makes the forest look nice and full. So there we go. We have a nice set of trees, and of course we'll add color to all this later using a color glaze on top of everything. Let's go ahead and make both of these layers into multiply composite methods for the treeline mid and the treeline back. That way they'll blend with the background better when we add in color later. Now let's add some trees to the foreground. So we will go above the snow layer and add a new layer. We'll call this trees foreground. And we will want to use a 9 for this. We'll keep using this same brush. So we can put our sketch back on and we can turn it up a little bit so that we can see kind of where our trees were. We're going to have a big one right here. And depending on how far you go above your horizon line, that's going to give a sense of height to the tree. So we have this one going quite a ways above it. And we'll have one over here that doesn't go quite as high. This is a kind of a baby tree here. And we'll have one back here as well. Now at this point, we don't really need our sketch anymore, so we can go ahead and just hide that. Or if you want to, you can just delete the layer. The next thing that we'll do is we'll add some snowdrifts, and this will be snow that got blown by the wind and is kind of piling up against the trees that are in the background here. So let's create a new layer for that and move it below the snow layer. And we will call this drifts. And we'll use the scratchboard tool for this. We'll select this snow color that we were using and we'll change it just a little bit so that we can see the difference. It's important to switch to your main color here. So I'm going to do that because I was still on that additional color from the fan dabs brush. So you'll have to remember, you always got to switch back and forth here. It gets a little confusing, even to me. So we'll use a smaller brush here, and these are just going to be areas where the snow has piled up, as I mentioned. But you probably want to use them strategically to go ahead and fill in some boring areas here. So see how there were these empty spaces? I went ahead and threw these in here. And that really helps just to fill in the composition and make it look more interesting. We'll want to, of course, soften the edges a little bit using the blur blender. This can be a little bit softer than the edge that's in the foreground, but really you just want to paint over it to soften it. Turn on preserve transparency and use that scratchboard tool to paint with the same color to cover up any potential white fringe that might be there. We can go ahead and start adding lighting and shading. First thing that we'll have to do is establish where our light source is going to be, because that's going to determine where all our highlights and shadows will be in this composition. So our main source of light is going to be the sun. We'll turn off preserve transparency. We'll create a new layer above the sky layer, and we will call this sun. We're going to choose white and the digital airbrush. And the brush we use, we want to be slightly larger than the diameter of the sun. So I'm going to go with something like this. And you want to paint with a tight circular stroke. Build up the sun in stages. So we have the center here. I use a slightly bigger brush and give it a little bit of a glow. There we go. And of course, if you want, you can move this around if it's not exactly where you want it. So maybe I'll move it right there. So now that our light is in place, we can start plotting out the shadows and highlights according to its position. So we will go to the sky layer and we'll use the same digital airbrush and we'll paint with darker and lighter values to create a radial gradient. Now that radial gradient is going to be lightest around the light source and it's going to get darker as it moves away. So I'm going to select a value of 6 here to start with, and I'm going to just start painting here. I'm kind of painting everywhere but in this area surrounding the sun. Make sure the corners are nice and dark. And it's okay if you paint too much, because you can always go ahead and paint back in with the original color if you do too much. Now I'm going to darken my color a little bit more. Just kind of concentrate on the edges. And then in the center, I'm going to use just kind of a 2 here, a lighter value, just to lighten the center a little bit there. Now we have a nice sense of a glow here in our sky. And if we want, we can go ahead and blend that with the Diffuse blur blender. Just kind of scrub over it and blend it all together and remove any weird brush strokes or harsh transitions that might be there. And there we go, we have a pretty nice looking sky.